It's my pleasure to introduce our colleagues from J. Cook University, Anthony Lake, Wade, Jono. Also, Gemma is joining in between with the Spanish and Australian institutions. They are researchers with a large experience, very interesting, mainly Anthony in basketball and military research, and rugby league in professional context with the Toyota Cowboys. So for us, it's a pleasure to listen to you and learn more about you and how do you apply this performance analysis research in your context. So Anthony, when you can, it's your time.
Okay, thanks, Miguel. Just taking a bit of a break here in northern Queensland. I feel really out of place here, mate. I didn't show a map of Australia where we are located, but we're in the north. We're on the Great Barrier Reef, as many will know, and you can see Jono there swimming with various animals as well. So here we go. Yeah, really cool in terms of that. Miguel, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to see everybody here and link in with our colleagues at Victoria University, but a range of our colleagues in Spain as well. And particularly given that ECSS is on this week, I'm really happy that we could all hook up together. So thank you very much. The plan is I'll give you a bit of an overview of some of the work we've done in basketball and some of the issues, I suppose, that are interesting. And then Wade, Corey and Tandia, or T, will give you some background information about what we've been doing in terms of rugby league, and they're presenting from the Cowboys Performance Science Hub. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands, seas and waters throughout Australia, particularly the lands of the Bindal and Walgarugabar peoples in which we're meeting today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And we have a large proportion of Indigenous Australians that are located within our area that we work with. So we try to acknowledge them as much as we can. So I just wanted to highlight some of the focus that we've had in terms of basketball. And I'm just highlighting 3 areas. You'll see there some of the people we've worked with. So we've had Miguel, Carl, Sam, and Zhang as well. You'll see some other names there as well. So Daniel, Conte, Alendro, Aaron Scanlon, etc. And what we've been focusing on is more elite competitions, so looking at Olympics, World Championships and NBA data. We've been looking predominantly at box scores and metrics associated with games, so trying to predict how we can actually win these games. Specifically, we've also been looking at more physiological data, particularly with basketball referees. So we've been looking at both national, international, FIBA referees, as well as, I suppose, more local referees looking at our elite and sub-elite levels. So we've looked at it a couple of different ways. Obviously, my background is very much physiology, so very interesting, and also very much a referee. I've had a long association with referees for the last 20 or 30 years. So I just wanted to highlight some examples of things that we've done. So this is some work that Carl Woods and I and others have sort of looked at. We looked at the Olympic data from the men's Olympic tournaments to see what kind of comparisons could we see. Was there an evolution? Was there a change in the way these were playing? And we're using a dissimilarity matrix, and we can actually see some overlap across the different Olympics. And the idea was to try and get some guidance to provide to coaches and teams of what past performance was like in success and whether we could actually help them in the future. Now, we approached various coaches, particularly of the Australian national teams, to give them some guidance in terms of this. But as you can see, it's quite robust. We've got a few changes across 2008, but literally we've got this nice abundance across all of the Olympics here. And we've published this out, and you can have a look at it. We also started to look at women's basketball, again, looking at the same timeframes using decision trees and trying to work out on our left here, you know, what are the characteristics that where you could lose 96, 97% of the time versus when you could win 91% of the time in Olympic basketball. And these are very similar characteristics that you'll see in most basketball games. It's your shooting percentage, it's your ability to get defensive rebounds, achieve steals, and reduce turnovers. And these 4 metrics have been pretty consistent. no matter whether you look at international basketball, state or regional basketball, or even national basketball as well. NBA, men's, women's, juniors, seniors, these variables seem to pop up. It's the combination of these, and it's actually the specific components or the thresholds of these that are really dictating whether or not you win at the Olympics. And we've looked at this a little bit further in terms of whether you're a medalist or not. It doesn't really seem to matter. From my perspective, what's really interesting is, going to a coach, the Australian Opals coach or the Boomers coach of our men's and women's national teams, and saying, rightio, if you want to win 91% of your matches, this is what you need to achieve. So you need to select players. You need to play to ensure that you actually get this, and also be able to monitor it during games. Check at half time or three-quarter time, etc. Are you achieving what is necessary to end up with these sorts of results at the end? And I'll talk about some of the responses we've had by those coaches. With Miguel and his group, both in Spain and also in China, we've also looked at the NBA statistics, looking at whether you have back-to-back matches, whether you have a day between matches, or you have 2 days between matches, and then looking at a range of variables to see, again, what can help to identify whether you're going to win or not. We see over here, again, defensive rebounds and steals, pretty prominent in all of these. Our shooting ability is also very important. And again, we sort of looked at whether it's close to the basket, whether it's further away or even far away. And then we also looked at some situational aspects in terms of location, our opponent quality, whether they're highly ranked or not, and also the pace of the match. And it didn't really matter, but you can see, depending on the rest, it really didn't matter. A lot of the variables themselves are pretty consistent or pretty robust in terms of performance. So, congestion throughout a season sometimes has been clarified as a problematic situation. But what we've seen, particularly in the NBA, is in fact that it doesn't have really much of an impact. We then expanded that to FIBA, international referees, and we looked at a couple of different methodologies, so quantile regression and multiple linear regression, again, looking at some of the variables that you would typically see of winning. And again, we saw consistency in terms of some of the metrics, defensive rebounds, our steals, our shooting ability, and our turnovers. We had some others here, so fouls was interesting because, again, that hasn't been a prominent variable that we've seen, but the others, again, we have seen pretty consistently. And it didn't really matter too much with the methodology, although there are some differences there. Interesting situational variables didn't have an impact, which is quite different to what we saw in the NBA. So it might be different, I suppose, interests and impacts that we have when you look at it more at an international level rather than a, whole of country comparison. As I said, we've been expanding into referees. I've got a long history with referees at a national, but also an international level. Here's one of our first studies looking at essentially what are the responses of referees that you get during a game. And this was an international women's tournament that we hosted here in Townsville many, many years ago. And we could at least start to document what are the physiological responses. And then our next move is to obviously look at the decision-making capacity, because we understand there's obviously a link between physical as well as cognitive load. What was interesting was that, when you look over here, we've got about 75% of the match is at a very high rate in terms of heart rate. Now, this was done some years ago, still three-man refereeing in basketball. What I've noticed, particularly over the last 5 to 6 years, is that I think this would actually be much lower. The mechanics of the referees has changed, so they're not running as much. They're more stationary, and the idea was that they were able to make better decisions as a result of that. We've done some more recent work, and we've seen those numbers actually come down. So the physical responses are actually reduced, which has an impact on their training. And again, we're discussing that with both national and international leagues. This one was done with state level referees, looking at player load, what was interesting, and particularly from our perspective, was sort of the relative load, was the fact that it actually declined during the match. And that is something that we don't consistently consider beforehand, is we thought that, in fact, you would expect the stress levels to be higher, you expect their heart rates to be greater, they're moving more, etc. And what we found, in fact, was quite the opposite. And this was at a state level, but we've actually confirmed this at a national level as well, is that the physical loading of the referees is actually reduced as the game goes along. And we expect that that means that they have more cognitive ability to make better decisions. We haven't sort of convinced ourselves about that, but that's sort of where we're looking at in terms of the future. So I just wanted to highlight just some of the areas that we've looked at. We've looked at both elite, sub-elite. We're looking at players, metrics. We're looking at officials, and a great interest in that. The various data we're looking at, and the fact that we're actually collaborating across quite a few, both within Australia, but Spain, China as well. What's interesting is, while we're focusing on predicting success or improving physical preparation, the irregularity in the interest, so the buy-in, coaches, administrators, and the referees and the players themselves has been quite variable. Some are really interested, but to be on the whole, I would have to say within the area of basketball, most are not interested. They don't really care. It might be different in Spain, but I can tell you at an international level and also within Australia, our players, referees, and coaches really have not advanced that far to consider this type of information. And so there's an educational process that we need to go with this as well. And obviously, I'm keen to collaborate as well as the rest of our colleagues in the area of basketball. Thank you very much. I'll move on and let the Performance Hub highlight some of the work we've been doing in rugby league.
Thank you, Miguel and Anthony, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. As Miguel said and Anthony said, we're part of JCU, and we're also embedded with a sporting organisation called the North Queensland Cowboys in the National Rugby League competition. So I thought I'd do a bit of an introduction around that, firstly. Given that rugby league is relatively new or novice around most people internationally. So before I do, just a quick heads up, because we're right at the back of the room. Myself, I'm a lecturer of sport and exercise science and based full-time with the Cowboys. Tanya Woods, our PhD student. And so is Corey, both of whom are employed full-time with the North Queensland Cowboys. So I'll quickly go into a little bit about the North Queensland Cowboys and about ourselves. So the North Queensland Cowboys are a rugby league group who are based in a professional competition. And rugby league's a bit of a hybrid between, or it's generated from rugby union. It's basically two less people on the field. And it's one of the premier professional competitions in Australia. I'm sure Alice and Sam and Carl will argue that, but that's okay. So rugby league is quite large in Australia, down the eastern seaboard. And with that, we've got the 16 professional teams. We have an unbalanced season each year. So we have 24 in our typical competition, 24 rounds, sorry. And as of next year, or as of this year, there's a large number of men's and women's teams, but the women's game is growing across the next 12 months, so which is pretty exciting. So they're the two national or the two top tier competitions within Australia. Below them lie state competitions and then development pathways, which we're also involved with. Just a little bit about our collaboration with our North Queensland Cowboys. Unfortunately, the images aren't turning up for some reason, but the three of us are permanently embedded with the Cowboys and have been for a number of years. But we've also just moved in the last 12 months into their high performance facility, where we have a research facility on the top floor of their new high performance centre, which is a beautiful picture that you can't see. But we've got we're only a small department at JCU, and within our department, we're very fortunate so far. In conjunction with the Cowboys, we've got 4 PhD students and a couple of honours students as well. Out of the actual hub itself, we've got a few others that operate out of here. with military and different sports for their PhDs and honours programs as well. Specifically with our collaboration with the Cowboys, we have a number of different projects that have operated over the last 10 to 15 years. We've also collaborated with the National Rugby League, which is the governing body. And as Anthony mentioned, we've gone down the path of the officiating demands. So looking at the referees, and in rugby league, there's a middle referee and 2 sideline officials. So there's 3 involved in that as well. Thanks to the introduction of Carl to our department many years ago, we started venturing a bit further down, exploring some performance analytics, but specifically within the training environment and development environment, which I'll talk about in a second. But as I said, we're a relatively small department, small university in regional Queensland, but we have a fantastic relationship with the Cowboys. Really good opportunities that present themselves through that collaboration, which is exciting. I'm just going to talk about some of our previous research, and I'm actually going to bring in Jonathan Connor's honours recently, but a lot of the work that we're doing because of our embedded nature is essentially trying to provide the peer review, the evidence-based foundations to which the club trains and develops their athletes. So I'm going to quickly talk about our talent development environment, and then Tanya's going to talk about our training environment, and Corey will talk about our performance analytics. So with respect to the training development, everyone wants to develop our athletes pretty well and relatively quickly. We have quite a large grasp on junior athletes, and progressing them to the top tier is everyone's dream. We don't have the football, the real football, soccer. We don't have the football academy systems that they do in Europe. So we do it rather regionally and remotely. It's distinctly different to a lot of pathways in sport. So we've tried to do some projects in and around that can help accelerate the progression of our athletes. The first project up there was done by Jonathan Connor, who's on the Zoom today. Just looking at different basic tech manoeuvres and what the experienced NRL or national or elite players were looking at compared to our pathway players, using eye tracking gazing analysis, looking at temporal occlusion, and just a project where the Cowboys were more than happy to take that on board, provide us with their athletes, but then also extend us the courtesy of extending some of those findings into their training, and ever since been using some of that. Another project that we've done, again, we think in conjunction with Carl, hopefully I haven't started any of his thunder today, but our PhD student who we had go through looking at our pathway specifically, but the development and the characteristics that distinguish between the lower divisions of our pathway. So basically our reserve grade, our next tier down, and then our younger pathways coming through. And we were looking at everything from a physical, a technical, and a tactical perspective, and introduced some rock curves, for example, distinguishing those lower divisions, so the 18s and 20s, and the under 18s and the under 20s, and seeing if they were distinguishable, which on most characteristics they were near identical. So, but how they differed to our state league or our second tier group, the progression of that naturally would be looking at that next state tier group to our elite group, which we'll have to do in the future. But our PhD student looked at the technical, tactical, and the physical demands of our pathway program, just trying to provide coaches with some information, some evidence around how we can better adapt our programs and look at implementing different methodologies to try and accelerate those progressions. Another one, again, sorry, Carl, another one that we looked at was basically, and probably the catalyst for the previous PhD, was really looking at the younger age groups and the older age groups, and looking at different analyses to work out how we could possibly distinguish the National Rugby League or the elite characteristics, and then those of the youth or the under 20s pathway at the time. Carl and colleagues and their colleagues have also gone and done that with the Australian system and the UK system, for example. So just looking at different ways of multidimensional analyses, looking at what and how they're distinguishable, and if they are, what can we break it down to? So just delineating that down to that, the previous project that I mentioned was, why are they different, how are they different, and what can we do to accelerate that? We've found within rugby league, prior to a lot of the stuff that Carl was able to implement with us and Corey's been able to follow on with, the level of statistical analysis in rugby league was basically standard deviations and Z-scores. So we've been working with a very raw and very new group. Since then, there's been some fantastic people come along with Chloe Cummins and a lot of others, Heidi Thornton, another one that have done some fantastic work that have started to accelerate that. So it's a very exciting time within rugby league. But up until the last 4 or 5 years was very, very archaic and very simplistic. And if it couldn't be done in an Excel spreadsheet, it basically was never done. So we're happy to be a part of that. And Corey and Carl and Sam and everyone have led the way with that, which has been really good. Some of the projects that we've got going on, again, in the talent development area, is basically we've got an honours student who's looking at our training representativeness, and not so much in the representativeness context of are we training like we play. We're looking at our youth training, the same as our elite training, because with COVID, we've had to call on different athletes from different times and pull them up from those younger divisions and put them into our senior competition, and we need to make sure that they can handle that transition. So we've been looking at just a particular small-sided conditioning game that goes on, and just looking at what's the technical and the tactical aspects to that, and how do they differ, and do they differ? And we're looking at getting some exciting stuff out of that at the moment, which is pretty great. Also, from a strength and conditioning perspective, looking at different training phases within that pathway program. Again, our younger development players aren't in an academy, or they're associated with us in an academy, but they're located all over northern Queensland. So we don't have a lot of opportunities to look at what we're doing. So we're providing feedback to those coaches regionally to help accelerate or to help transition those pathway players and make them faster, make them stronger, but also help them perform on the field. We've got another PhD student who's with a rival rugby league side, who's looking at exercise-induced muscle damage and how that's impacting performance, particularly with the different turnarounds. So from game to game, with our 24 games, we have anywhere between a 5-day turnaround and a 7-day turnaround between games. So we're looking at different ways in which the training load impacts our performances on that. And then, as I mentioned at the start, we've got a future project with a PhD student coming on board at the end of the year to look at development and identification within the within our women's program, which we're starting up our national women's team next year. So some very exciting times. Predominantly working with our performance unit to try and implement a lot of this. Corey's taken a lot of it along and help with coach education and developing our coaches. And Tandy is working with our performance unit. So I'll let those guys talk about it themselves. But yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. My name is Tandia, but everyone calls me T. So I thought I'd talk a little bit today about my PhD and also my position here at Cowboys and some of the research we're doing around that. So my current role is sports scientist for Cowboys. I started initially just as a PhD student and helping in a sports science manner on the side. And now I have taken a full-time role at Cowboys and I'm doing my PhD part-time. So we've got a nice long 6 or 7 years ahead of this. So I thought I'd introduce some of the work that I'm doing with my PhD. The beauty of my role is that my research and my everyday role is very much intertwined, which is awesome. So my primary role, of course, is GPS analysis and data and representation for the coaches. So I'm looking in my PhD to provide some more contextual information. So Wade sort of mentioned that within rugby league, I feel like we're a little bit behind the 8 ball in sports science. It's quite not as up to date as what some other sports are doing. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that now. So the metrics and the methodological styles that we use in GPS analysis, really commonly, we're still seeing things like whole match analysis. So total distance, relative distance, things like that across a whole rugby league match, so 80 minutes of play. We still look at that, which is important for monitoring volumes and things like that, but it's not very representative of what actually is occurring in the game. And I feel like I'm in this position where the coaches are asking for things that are more contextual, and we're just not quite there yet in terms of research. I'm trying to bring it a little bit up to speed and make it more contextual for the coaches. So like I was saying, the metrics that we're using are very much whole match analysis, and we're also using methodological styles that are of that manner too. So whole match analysis, halves, there are starting to more commonly use smaller time periods such as 1, 3, 5 and 10-minute intervals. These might be fixed lengths or rolling averages, but once again, they're kind of just times that have been randomly plucked out to look at smaller periods of the game, but there's no real contextual information around this. It might be 1 minute at any point in the game and we don't know where that's occurring. We're also seeing the most demanding passages of play coming up a little bit now in rugby league. As most of you know, that's the maximal physical load of a given time window. But once again, there's still very little context around this. It's just any point within the whole game that we're seeing this data, nothing around before or after that. So to give you a bit of an example, this is the NRL report that they send out to all the clubs. So the NRL just get our GPS match data. They don't get any of our training data. They do up this report for us and send it out to all of the clubs. So you can see it's broken down reasonably into like small positional groups, which is handy, but we're still using things like total distance, high speed distance, very high speed, average speed, all that kind of stuff that has very little contextual meaning. And I always give the example of Cowboys last season. We didn't do so well, sort of towards the bottom end of the ladder. We had some of the highest high-speed meters, but it was because we were chasing errors and things like this. So there's very little contextual information around these reports that were being sent, and therefore little contextual information being given back to the coaches. So some of the newer sampling methods that we're seeing is this phase of play style. So breaking up things into attack, defense, and transition, which is our major phases of play. And I think what's important about this is that when we look at train the way we play, so when we're training, we use attack drills, defense drills, we have transition games. So my first study in my PhD is interviewing some coaches and analysts across rugby league clubs, asking them about the importance of GPS and how they find it useful, if they do at all. And one of the most common themes I'm seeing so far is that train the way we play. It's probably mentioned in almost every interview I do. So it's really, really common. And I just feel like we're not really doing that at the moment. We might be looking at our high speeds within a game or our peak intervals, but we're not looking at when this might have occurred. Was it attack? Was it defense? What was happening around that? So something else that Corey and I are looking a little more in depth into, which sort of relates to this, is our winning versus losing seasons. So we're in this really unique position where we can use North Queensland Cowboys as a case study. So this was us in 2021. At the end of the season, we were 14th. And now compared to 2022, we're coming third at the moment. So we're a very unique position where just within 2 seasons, we have seen this dramatic change, and that we also have access to all of the GPS data of both of these seasons. So I guess the main question we're looking at around here is what has changed between these 2 seasons. We obviously know there's a magnitude of things that have occurred here, but just to start really surface level, look at some of the GPS data. There's very little research on this in rugby league between winning and losing teams, and then obviously very rare that it happens to a team in such a short amount of time. So very unique position here. There's some research on whole game analysis, things like total distances covered by winning teams was greater, greater low speeds achieved by winning teams, and greater high intensity efforts. seen by winning teams. So really basic stuff here. And things that we're seeing. So this is some GPS data from us this season. Looking at our 1, 3, and 5 minute peak running intervals. So again, some random times that we're looking at, but at least it's a start when we look at our winning and losing games. So you can see the starter points with green circles are games that we've won. And we're actually seeing that intensity is lower for the players across those games, as opposed to games that we've lost, they're working a lot harder. So we're starting to see this trend across this season, which I think will be really interesting when we start to compare it to 2021. All right, I'm going to hand over to Corey now. Thanks for listening, guys.
So I'm now the performance analyst at the North Queensland Cowboys. I took over from Wade after starting my PhD up here, and I've been pretty heavily involved in the performance analysis space. As part of my PhD, we wanted to look at some of the technical and tactical performance indicators that were indicative of success within the NRL, but from two different sides of the coin. So we wanted to look at from a whole team level, what were the team playing styles that were indicative of winning within the competition over a period of time, and then how are these playing styles then affected by differing match contexts, whether a team that is quite successful or at the top of the ladder, whether their playing style is persistent across the season or across multiple seasons, or whether that's changing, and if it is changing, what is it that is occurring? So we might be able to jump on early and perhaps buck the trend and maybe help dig ourselves out of a hole and up the ladder. And then on the flip side of that, we wanted to look at from a positional perspective, can we distinguish different positional groups using just the match statistics that we have available? And if we can, how are we able to explain the influence of these different positional groups in the context of overall team performance, so winning and losing games? So we looked at 5 seasons of data. It was a retrospective series of studies. So over 1,000 matches across 5 years. And the technical data that we looked at was predominantly chosen in conjunction with the coaching staff when I first started here. So I sat down with them and went through hundreds of different variables that we had available, and they provided suggestions on ones that they thought were and weren't as important. And we started to whittle them down from there as to what we thought might be influential. And then the additional match contextual information that we had along the way. So where we're playing, the scoreline of the game, the outcome, and the quality of opposition that we're playing. So when we were looking at team playing styles, we used something like a principal component analysis. Thanks to Miguel for throwing me down that path. And interestingly, we found that from a team level, of the 9 factors that were resolved, it was predominantly attacking. So in the NRL, obviously, we've got different phases of players Tim was talking about, but when we're looking at what's important with winning and losing, the data that we're seeing resolved is that it was predominantly attacking focus that was more important when it comes to resolving the important playing styles in the NRL. Interestingly, though, there was only 2 of those 9 factors that had any interaction across season and rank when observing team playing style, and that was the play the ball won and lost, or we talk about play the ball speed often in rugby league, and then effort areas, so kick pressures and support plays. Interestingly, those 2 factors or those 2 key areas have been quite instrumental, I personally believe, in a large part of our turnaround this year. As rules have changed over recent seasons, ruck speed or play the ball speed, and watching teams like us and the Panthers play, kick pressure has been hugely instrumental in helping to change the outcome of the game. So funnily enough, when we were looking at this a couple of years ago, it appeared to be quite important, and I believe that's quite important as to the style of play that we try to implement at the moment. Further on, we then wanted to look at how these playing styles that we had resolved, how do they change across different match contexts. Of the 9 that were resolved, 4 of them were able to correctly classify match outcomes, so winning and losing, 81% of the time. So that's really cool for us to be able to understand that if we can see what type of playing styles different teams we're coming up against, what style of play they tend to roll out of the park with, and what we can try and combat them with, and whether we can then help turn the outcome of the game from there. So that was really cool, but unfortunately, in contrast to a lot of other research that we've seen, match location or playing home and away didn't seem to affect the playing styles that were being resolved, and neither did the opposition rank or the score lines that we've seen. Moving beyond this, we wanted to look at the positional characteristics. So we started with 4 different playing groups, and this was largely determined by the coaching staff. And we used the same performance indicators and classified these into 14 different factors. Same again using principal component analysis. We then wanted to try and reclassify these positions using these factors, and we identified 2 additional positional groups. So we had utility backs and interchange forwards. And from a team perspective, whilst we only might have found 3% of all players were considered utility backs, they were classified at quite a successful rate, and we are seeing that across different teams. Most teams on the interchange will tend to select a player that can cover a number of different positions. So being able to identify the characteristics that have been largely important for this type of playing position over a series of time may be important for how coaches then select this type of player to sit on their bench if we need someone to come in and inject a bit of energy or help us turn a game at any different time. Further on, we wanted to look at how these positional groups then affected team performance from a positional level. And we found that interchange forwards, adjustables and utility backs each uniquely influenced the collective team performance in different ways. On the flip side of that, we had 3 different positional groups that we previously classified that were all similarly grouped based on their performance. And that sort of suggested to us that maybe that they have a less distinctive role within a team. And despite the fact that we often try to train within positional groups and want to elicit specific characteristics from certain types of players, perhaps there are roles within the team that can be a bit more generic and we don't necessarily have to plan for at such a deep level. Interestingly though, of all the characteristics that we did use to help explain this, they were largely defensive characteristics. So when I talked about the team level playing styles before, 6 of the 9 characteristics were attacking, 2 were defensive, and 1 was considered more of a contested or an effort style. Whereas then when we looked at a positional level, the more important characteristics were defensive and not attacking. So perhaps from a positional perspective, it's about getting their job done defensively and reducing their errors in attack. But then from a team perspective and how we want to execute a game plan, obviously there's a bit more importance relied on how we attack and how we turn over the ball. So a big part of my job, obviously I have access to exorbitant amounts of data, and every time I talk to Miguel over Zoom, he's coming up with dozens of different projects about things we could be doing and how we could be implementing things within the rugby league space. And I've spoken to him numerous times about some of the things we could be doing, and also some of his colleagues in the UK. And at the moment, we're starting to look at how we can track performance over periods of time, both from a team and an individual level. From an individual level, we're hoping that we might be able to use this as a recruitment to help understand how players are tracking across the season, into contract years, how they perform on the back of signing contracts, and that might help us evaluate whether we're identifying the right people or whether we're signing people and perhaps they don't quite have what it takes to hold on long term for us. And then from a team perspective, we might be able to identify trends within the competition, where the competition's heading. A team like the Panthers have been on top for the last 2 years. What is it that they do well, and how can we jump on the back of what they're doing and perhaps try and jump ahead of what it is that we're seeing that they're doing, and how can we implement that for our own team?
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Apologies for running a bit over time, Miguel. Just excited.
Thanks, Wade. Thank you, Anthony, Wade, T, and Corey. Great to see you again online, not face to face, but it's always happy to meet you again. Thank you so much, all of you, for your presentations. I think that now we can better figure out, not me, but mainly the other colleagues from Spain can better figure out all the approaches that you do in the Cowboys hub, and also with Anthony, with the referees and other researchers investigating in performance analysis and sports sciences in basketball and rugby league. So I think that now we can, at the end of the meeting, we can share some ideas and some ways to cooperate and collaborate with you all in different contexts. And rugby league is also a very interesting topic.